All right, so we're live. We're live and recording. So evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm sure we're gonna have people trickling in as we go too. I see more and more names popping up. Oh gosh. All right, let me do this. That'll be better. All right, so welcome. This evening, we're calling this evening Breathe. Thank you for being here. The notes I have are not right in front of me. Okay. So I want to take a few minutes before we start to just kind of explain the process here. So basically, the goal of this webinar / discussion time is going to kind of happen in 3 parts. The first part is going to be that where we actually go into the issues, the talking points, all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of talking, dealing with the what of things. The second part is going to be more discussion Q&A time. And then the third part is time for prayer. So there was an FAQ that I wrote and sent out beforehand. But in case that you didn't get the chance to see it, basically what the FAQ was getting across is that, the goal of this time here is not that by the end, you're an expert in this field, or that, you're going to go out and march to City Hall or something like that. We're not here to promote violence. We're not here to endorse any particular party or politician. The goal here is simply to stand as young Catholics in the midst of a world which is confronting suffering on a very broad scale, and be able to say, we as a church have to have a response to this. So how do I, as a young person, as a Catholic, make that response? And it comes in 3 stages, which kind of mirror the flow of this evening. So I'm going to switch right over to a little document I did real quick, just so that you can kind of see the general flow of the evening. All right, so basically, the first part, where we're talking about the issues and all that kind of stuff, that's where we're getting informed, we're building a knowledge base. We need that knowledge base in order to not just talk intelligently about these issues, but really know how to make a genuine response, which is more like the part 2 and part 3 of what's going on here. We want to make sure that when we make that response, first of all, that we're informed, and then from there that we've actually taken this to prayer. So, this reflection and prayer time, Q&A time, all that stuff, that's all there so that we know how we can make a good prayerful response to this. And, I'm not sure how involved everyone on this call is with Jesus Youth, but a big part, something that made a lot of waves in Jesus Youth last year, for the past year or so, I'd say, is this notion of empathetic repentance and unilateral forgiveness. And so we have to be able to look at these issues and see what is the interior conversion that I need to undergo so that I can begin that process of change that needs to happen in the world. Basically, to summarize it very simply, this is a journey from the world to the church, to my own heart and my own relationship with God, and then flowing back out from God into the community and into the world. And hopefully, for anyone tuning in, some of the things we talk about will be things you're hearing for the first time, and we'll all hopefully walk away more informed. But most important of all is that we'll all walk away with a better sense of how I can see Christ in what's going on in the world and see Christ in my suffering neighbor. Now, one more thing I want to point out is that there's you might see on the call, there's a participant named chat/Q&A. That's just me on my other computer. So if you got questions or things that you want to bring up during part 2, where we're doing the discussion Q&A stuff, chat it to me. And then I'll bring it up. I'm going to be kind of the facilitator for this discussion. And that's just mostly so that we're not all talking over each other and the conversation stays focused. And then just guidelines go over, again, keep it civil. We're not going to lobby. Know what you want to say before you say it. And above all, just remember charity and truth. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing this. And we're going to get to the main event. So first, to introduce our guest here is Hannibal Callens. Hannibal is my best friend. We've known each other since we were in high school. we got to know each other in theater. He's a comedian and an entertainer. He's a goofball. He's the world's biggest extrovert. He's been one of my biggest supporters for probably about close to the last 10 years of my life. Over my own, of course, in my own journey to get to know Christ. And we joke in my family that my dad says he's his other son. He spent about the past about 8 years or so, every Thanksgiving and Christmas, he's at my house. This is the man who's like, closest to my actual brother, who's not my brother. He's my day one. So he's also the former president of his college's African American Cultural Society. So he's spoken about these issues for a while. He's very articulate on them. And, being an entertainer, he likes to talk. So I'm going to stop talking and say, welcome, Hannibal. Thanks for doing this.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, first and foremost, for having me and allowing me to share this night with you all. I'm just beyond honored. I know not only how important Jesus Youth as an organization has been for Chris personally, but he's told me so much about how far-reaching your community, is, and the good that not only you guys share out, but the good that you build within people. And that amount of formation, I truly admire, because it allows to help shape healthy people that go out into the community and spread that to all over. So I am more than honored not only to get to share this experience with you guys, but to get to do this with my best friend. Because Chris and I have talked about these kinds of things for forever, and it's just nice to get to have other people become part of the conversation and share that knowledge, because the beauty about knowing things is to share it with other people. So thank you all for having me.
Thanks again for being with us, Hannibal. All right, so I think like a good place to start is talking about the history of racism in the United States, especially after the Civil War. So I think like anyone from anywhere in the world who's like, read up on history knows that the African slave trade was a major part of American history across the continent, but in the United States especially. And obviously, like one of the key reasons for the American Civil War was slavery. But not everyone really knows about the history of slavery, or rather the history of racism in the United States after the Civil War. Sometimes all we kind of get with history at a glance is just, well, there was Jim Crow and there was Martin Luther King Jr. about 100 years later, and now we're here. So let's kind of like color in the picture a little bit. So Hannibal, let's talk a little bit about racism in the United States post-Civil War.
Okay. So first, one thing that relates to post-Civil War, I think a common misconception people often have about slaves is that all that they did was lots of field work and things like that. However, a lot of the slaves had, these were artisans, these were engineers, these were people that were masters of crafts and trades. So, and even within slavery and during that, they had mastered these things. So after the Civil War, after slavery is abolished, there's a misconception that slaves kind of just didn't know what to do. But what you find is, there was a period of time, and I'm not a master of the specifics, but what you find is that there was actually a lot of growth happening right after that, during it's an era called Reconstruction, where you have a lot of Black people scrambling, taking the skills and the knowledge that they have, building wealth, building all sorts of, things like that, business and stuff like that. So there was a lot of growth happening there. But and this relates to things like this relates to the prison industrial complex. And this, again, just kind of an overview just to help people get a better picture and hopefully inspire others to like dig deeper. But what you started having was it became illegal for people, like, for example, loitering was something that could get you thrown in jail. And the purpose of that was that the slave owners and like the police forces and whatever, they could start arresting Black people who now didn't have jobs or places to stay, stuff like that. So they could throw them into the prisons, where at the prisons, you're working pretty much slave labor for pretty much slave wage. And so you still got to keep people in that same wheel. And that's just one aspect of that connects post-slavery right to here as far as systemic racism, especially as far as wealth is concerned. And there are like scholars that have done lots of research about the money side and looking at slavery all the way up to like modern day, about how much money was made from slavery during the Jim Crow era, things like that. And it helps put a lot of this information and into a different perspective. I guess for me personally, it made me understand like why that would persist.
So in other words, like a lot of the major factors for the kind of the keeping the system in place, like the kind of prison industrial complex and all those sorts of things, the big motivator was the need to sustain the economy, like post-slavery, basically.
Right.
And there was the individuals on a very broad level of society, like high up level of society, I guess I should say, kind of saw like that this was an easy way to generate a lot of wealth for very cheap.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. You also had sharecropping, and sharecropping was something where after slaves were freed, they didn't have a lot of places to go, but they would be able to, some slave masters would be like, hey, you can come stay here, and I'm going to lend you the tools. I'm going to lend you particular resources in order for you to like stay here and work, and that way you can stay. But then what you ended up with was like the interest rates on stuff. This is the simple version. The interest rates were ridiculous. So you were never able to pay that off, and you ended up stuck in that cycle.
Right. And like an indentured servitude kind of thing.
Pretty much indentured servitude, yeah.
Right. So what are like, something I kind of want to jump forward a little bit. Like not a lot of people know about about Black Wall Street and the Tulsa riots. And that's kind of like a major talking point in post-Civil War history for civil rights. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a Black community. Now, this is in the midst of like segregation, right? And this is like segregation is long lasting. At this point, segregation is, you're deep in segregation. So what you had was whites only businesses in towns, Black only businesses in towns. And in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I said that redundantly, but it was called Black Wall Street. And Black Wall Street was one of the wealthiest Black-owned cities and like towns, where everything was owned by Black people. It was Black people living there. And it was a very self-sufficient, healthy, and very wealthy place to be. They had a bunch of different businesses, hospitals, like hospitals, banks, restaurants, all the stuff you have in a economy, right, was within Black Wall Street. And you had it to where like they even had 2 movie theaters. They had 2 movie theaters, both that were Black owned. And there was a person, I recently learned this, there was a person that actually like owned a plane. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal in like the 20s, you know. So
what happened?
In 1921, there was an African American man whose name escapes me right now, but he went to the white side of town because he worked there. He got into an elevator, and there was a white woman who worked in the elevator. When he went in, He went into the elevator, the door closed. And this is how the story goes. But then people heard a scream, the door opened, and this black man ran out. And that woman, she accused him of assaulting her. So what then had happened was a whole bunch of the white men from the world in that area gathered together. They went to the police department where this African American man was being held, and they said, "We want to lynch him. You have to let us in." So a lot of the armed black men from Black Wall Street gathered together, and they went to the sheriff's department 2 times to say, "Hey, we're here to protect the place, so they can't get them." And the sheriffs, they were like, "Nope," they denied that. So the second time that they came, when they were leaving, there was a group of white men that showed up. And some people say that it was one white man, but there ended up being a fight because one of the white men had a gun. They fought with one of the black men. There was a shot fired. The white man was hit and killed. And so then from that point forward, a riot took place. And throughout this riot, all of Black Wall Street was destroyed. We're talking like acres and acres, blocks and blocks of black businesses, black homes, black wealth destroyed. And worst of all is that it was around like 3,000 people killed, men, women, and children, because what had happened was there was an initial group of white men that had fought them and chased them back to the town. And then the next morning, an even bigger group of the white people from that area came to attack them. And they had burned the houses, burned the buildings, killed the people who weren't able to escape. And they would run people down out of their houses if they could find them. And it was...
And I think I've seen some pictures of like, you know, before and after for Tulsa and Black Wall Street. As far as I know, it was actually the most destructive riot in American history.
Right.
And I know the KKK had a major hand in that riot as well.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's like an important snapshot that like just, and that was 1920 something.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know, which is just about 100 years ago now, actually. So, you know, we're getting closer to the present day. So okay, so then kind of like, yeah.
And so some of the things that are important that kind of connect that to the much more modern day, and I'm sorry, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you have to think when it comes to things like business and wealth, everything is legacy based. Everything is based on legacy. There's very few things, and I think the social media era is really like one of the first times in world history where you have something that starts out of nowhere and then it just blows up like Facebook. But especially back in the day, everything is legacy based. So Black Wall Street is called a riot because, and this is something else I recently learned, I don't know if it's within the nation or just in Oklahoma, but there's no statute of limitations on a massacre or murders, but there is one on if there's a riot. So after so long, you can't be held responsible. You can't legally be arrested or held responsible for what happened during a riot. But what Tulsa, Oklahoma was, it was a massacre. People attacked this black town of men and women who had built their lives there. They had built wealth. They had raised families there, men, women, and children living in this area, and everything they had worked for was burned down. Right? People were killed. And when someone is killed and they're a master of a trade, they're not able to pass that knowledge down. So their children and their children's children become further and further removed from the information that they knew. Right? And so when you look at that and remember that everything in business, especially big business, is legacy based, this is one of the many times within American history and within the history of this nation and within Black history that Black communities built up. Like the kinds people say, oh, Black people should get it together. They should, they need to do this, that, and that. Well, we did. And we did it time and time again. And this was the outcome. there would be massacres where everything we built, where everything Black men and women had put their backs, their hearts and their soul into to build, to pass on, was burned. And that has a lot to do with the difference in resources that are within Black families today and that's within Black communities today. Because when you look at the biggest businesses and legacies, that's what it all is. It's this person made this much, they handed it down. This person made this much, they handed it down. And if you can destroy, if someone's legacy is destroyed for long enough, you eventually start to get generations that are unable to access the information to pull that up. Also, this last thing I'll say about this is that a lot of that history isn't taught to people in school. Myself and most of the people that I know who know this information had to go off of the rails of education to learn it. And for me personally, it completely reshapes how I understand and understood the current position where Black people are at. Right.
So, you know, I guess like maybe like one way we can kind of summarize it is like everything that we see today has a precedent. Like it doesn't just, it's not a problem that shows up out of the blue. And, you know, you brought up something interesting there where you said like, you know, there are people who just say like, oh, well, you know, the African-American community just needs to get it together and they'd be fine. Well, like you said, they did, and they were hurt in the process. So, you know, I think that's important because when we talk about like major issues inside of the African-American community, broken families, you know, difficult access to education, you know, crime, drugs, all those sorts of things. Like those didn't get there just because like, oh, well, Black people can't get it together. No, they're there because like there's, like you said, there's legacies. This is the legacy that was handed down to them.
Right.
And like, I think that's, oh, sorry, I was going to say, I think that's a legacy that a lot of us who are not part of the community that we miss. Like we don't see that fact, you know?
Yeah, and so, even then, we don't see a lot of that too, you know, because you really do have to go outside of what you get taught in school, and you have to get focused on Black history to learn these things. And I think maybe like, you know, an analogy for it is when people always say you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And one thing that people say in response is, well, I didn't have any boots. But learning about this makes you realize that people have told us to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps for our entire lives. And when we did, our boots were stolen.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I think that's a quote from Martin Luther King, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, because he said something like that. So, anyway, okay, so let's kind of transition over to current events then. You know, I could go down the list of names, and I'm not going to mention everybody, but, you know, most recently it was George Floyd. We also, you know, Breonna Taylor now is in the news. Ahmaud Arbery was just 2 weeks ago, or 2 or 3 weeks ago. Just 3 really recent events, but I mean, we could look at dozens. You know, how do we even, like, where do we begin to talk about this? You know, it's like such a charged issue. You know, how do we address this kind of violence, like in the world?
It's really frustrating, you know, that things like this keep happening. And for myself personally, like bad people or people that seek to do harm to others, they're gonna do that. So there isn't a lot that can be done to stop people like the men who hunted down Ahmaud Arbery, because they wanted to hurt people. This scary thing, and what really breaks, my heart, and I know it breaks the heart of others as well, is seeing how the precedents of the system we live in will jump through hoops and do all sorts of things that, rather than defend the justice of an American citizen or of a person, people work very hard to twist and turn the stories in order to try to justify the wrong that happened, rather than push for the justice in place. And
So what are
Like, and that,
what kind of holds that in place there? This is kind of
um,
like a leading question, because we were just talking about this earlier today. But
yeah,
we were talking about qualified immunity, right?
yeah.
So like, can you explain that, because that might not be something all of us have heard before.
Okay, so qualified immunity, so it protects particular. I think it's people that are federal, but it protects people that have in particular positions from being sued or held accountable in the law based on
Right,
something
because
happening within it.
right, because they're like basically like government people, right? So like, I think the
Yeah.
idea is like judges, but police officers, military, all those sorts of people,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's like there have been people in particular situations where like an officer sees something and he wants to go do something about it, but he's not able to because he's worried about getting sued about
Right,
something that
right,
might go wrong later. And so
right. That would be qualified immunity.
qualified immunity is there in place so that an officer, just in that example, an officer doesn't have to be worried about, oh, I could get it sued. He can just do his job and be protected from what
Right.
happens.
That's like the goal of what it's supposed to be.
That's
But
the perfect way to put it. That is
right,
the goal of what it is supposed to be.
right. And then what happens in these situations is when there's an abuse of power on the part of someone who's in like civil authorities, it becomes like that they have very little legal accountability in the process.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, like what ends up happening is something like qualified immunity ends up being abused, and now we're not able to hold people accountable who misuse their power, to put it simply. And because they're protected by qualified immunity, you have people.
It reminds me a lot actually of like kind of what we deal with, like what we dealt with in the church, in the Catholic Church, when we faced the clergy abuse scandals, where there is a system, like a hierarchical system in place, and there are certain protections that are given to people in authority. And because there's not accountability, yeah, most people are good people. They're not going to do harm. But like when someone does do harm, because that accountability system isn't in place, you get situations like what happened, for instance, with like Cardinal McCarrick or those sorts of things. So, obviously like there's a lot of differences, but you can definitely draw connections like in the Catholic world where, there's like I think what we're looking for in terms of just like the police side of things, like, I mean, we know that most cops are good people who are just doing their job, but the reality is that like they're like situations like these demonstrate that we need improvements in our accountability system, I think.
Yeah.
um
Hmm.
Go ahead.
And yeah, so especially in that effect, and I know that Black people get lots of criticism because of our distrust of police, but it goes very deep. But first of all, the police there's a not just like anecdotal, but like the foundations of the police are rooted in subjugating, like, our growth as a people. That's a really deep topic that we don't have to get into right now, but just in this particular context, I like to ask, like, kind of think about it. Um if like when I get pulled over by a police officer, what scares me is the fact that it isn't so much like what scares me is the fact that if this officer was to hurt me, like there's nothing, or there's too little in place that would be able to protect me. Even with particular situations, it's become clear that police have lied about particular like details that they use to set up the story they want. But
Mm.
they're also the police. So if there was, and they are the authority for justice that we depend on. So how are we supposed to question the story that they tell us, right? Outside
Right, in
of,
other words, it's your word against theirs.
right? And they
Right.
are in a position of authority. So, like, what do we do? And having accountability, it would protect us because good officers won't get harmed because they do their jobs right. But when
Right.
something goes wrong, now we're able to protect American citizens. right?
Not
We're
just
able
even Black people at that point, but everybody.
yeah, and like and what like I recently had come to discover that talking about all this stuff is that when we look at this issue, people that are fighting to increase accountability for police and the people that criticize them or stand against them, is that fighting to change police accountability, just in this one aspect, is going to protect everyone. Because people aren't going to go into office and have a law written that's only going to protect Black people from this, right? And all you have to do to find diversity within police misconduct is look into the communities of the poor. Poor people of all colors and creeds get mistreated by the police, for whatever the circumstances might be. So accountability is not increasing accountability gets drawn up by these party lines that sometimes cause people to miss the truth at the matter. But at its core, this is an issue of people trying to fight to protect everyone. People are pushing, and if we can hold our police accountable, first of all, it adds so much more authenticity and legitimacy to what they do. Because we know that when you do your job right, you're held to that. And we know we can trust that you'll do your job right. Because when someone does their job wrong, they're not allowed to just go off scot-free and keep doing it. You know?
Right.
When
The system is in place to protect everybody.
Exactly.
Right.
And
so like when, I don't know, because I think that like a lot of people, so I'm going to kind of like switch the topic just a little bit, but similar thing, but there's like let's not use George Floyd, let's take another example. Like a few years back we had Trayvon Martin, and people point out the fact that like like one line that I kind of heard was, well, this kid was up to no good, like, and I think that we kind of are missing the point when we focus, like when we let that be the main focus. And I'm not talking about whether he was up to no good or not. I think like what we lose sight of when we say like, or, when we say like, well, he had a criminal record or all those sorts of things, like that may be true, or it may not be true, but the main point is that somebody died, right? So like, we don't want any kind of system in society where like, where people feel like they're at risk of being killed, right? Just for being out and about. So I don't know. Do you have anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, it's always so difficult to talk about because I think it can be hard for us to wrap, for everyone to wrap their heads around. But I mean, the truth of the matter is that whatever, just in the example of Trayvon Martin, whatever past he had does not justify him being killed. It did not justify or legitimize him losing his life. And what can happen is, or at least I believe what takes place is, people use they use a person's past to gray the water between what happened. Because what happened was he was followed by someone who wasn't even a police officer, who called 911 and 911 told him not to follow. That person still hunted down Trayvon Martin, and they got in a fight, and Trayvon Martin lost his life. I believe that at face value, like we were able to understand that, but when people start to devalue a person's character, when they start to attack a person's character in a way that isn't truly relevant to this particular situation, it's in order to convince people to lower the value of that person's life, making it more okay, to justify, to justify like, oh well, he was up to no good.
Right. And I think that kind of comes from that place in us where like we don't entirely feel comfortable with the fact that someone in authority messed up, basically. But it also kind of reminds me in a different sense of like when people get into the I don't know, I guess like the difference between like when we say Black Lives Matter, and then kind of people fire back with, well, all lives matter. You know, I got to be honest. Sometimes I try not to roll my eyes because I don't think anyone was denying that all lives are valuable. But, you know, I think like the response, all lives matter, when you throw it back like in the face of somebody who says, oh, well, Black Lives Matter, I think what that does is kind of the same thing. It's kind of that generalizing thing, which is kind of trying to de-escalate what you know, the other person's trying to say. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
And what it
yeah.
is, it's like, it's a curveball thrown to like I guess to shift the conversation away from what the conversation is supposed to be about. Because when people are saying that Black Lives Matter, at no point has anyone like pushed from the claim that, oh, Black Lives Matter more than anyone else's. And it's really I think it becomes easier to understand the nuance of that with the more you understand about African American people, our history, and our experience here in this nation. Because if you believe that Black men and women have had the same, put it like this, which is, stick with me here, this might get a little weird. The Black History Month. A lot of people argue that, oh, there shouldn't be a Black History Month, right? Because we're all equal and whatever. And that would make sense if Black history was as prominent in what we learn as non-Black history, to just put it simply. So even with Tulsa, Oklahoma, I've gone my entire life without learning that in school until I stepped out and learned it for myself, right? So just in that example, it shows that if we're looking at American history, we're not representing everyone properly in American history. So, so it becomes important to highlight the communities that we are not discussing, because not to shine them over anyone else, which is honestly impossible because of the difference, right? Like, I don't think it's really.
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, because of how little we do learn about Black history outside of the same old things, you know, every February, like about Martin Luther King, and we only learn so much about him and his movement. It's kind of impossible for us to be like, oh, Black History Month, you know, because come March 1st, we're going to be learning about whoever else, and they are most often not representative of us and what we've done in this nation and what we fought to gain. So, coming back to the all lives matter argument, all lives matter works if everyone mattered equally out of the gate. But because there is this disparity, not only in our communities, not only in our resources, but in how we are respected in this nation, that all lives matter argument, or treating Black lives matters as though it's saying they matter more, is inaccurate. People are like with Black History Month, attempting to bring attention to something that we are not being shown, something we're not learning about in school, something people are not learning about and experiencing in their day to day. This is a highlight, not it's highlighting these experiences.
Right. It's building up one group. It's not tearing down another group.
Right. And sometimes I think sometimes people can lose sight of that there's enough love out here for everyone. We can all love ourselves and one another without.
And it's very easy to just say love everybody because it's a very generic thing to say, you know?
Yes. It's
so,
a very.
I'm gonna keep us rolling here just so that we keep going. But somebody brought up a good question, which is actually a good segue to this next part, where we're talking more about like individual level of like what we can do individually, like in our own, just say like biases and prejudices, attitudes, all those sorts of things. What can we do to change, make a difference, all that sort of stuff? Because somebody asked, going under the assumption that most people are good, but we can't control those who do bad things, what can the average person do to build relationships peacefully? And what do you specifically, Hannibal, find most offensive from people who are trying to help?
What do I find offensive from people who are
from
trying to help?
people? Yeah.
Okay. That's a really good question.
Actually, I'm gonna let you think on that one, and I'm gonna throw another one out there that somebody asked. The use of the N-word. So I think this is just my experience. And you can talk about your experience, but I'll just say mine first. Like, there are a lot of people of color who are not Black, but people of color who think that using the N-word is acceptable. What would you say about
It is not. It period. And so similar to the oh goodness. Okay. So it isn't, and that's not only is that a really like deep topic to get into, it's a very important one because discussions about the N-word have to, if they're had correctly, have to eventually come down to this idea of respect and this core idea of how much do we really respect African American people, their experience in this nation, their plight in this nation, and like how much do we respect them? So the whole N-word comes from terms used to describe Black slaves way back in slave times, and that
right.
word and all of its like little side versions have been used and are related directly to something that has hurt Black people all the way up to today. It recently came out that the people who, the men who killed Ahmaud Arbery, it was found out that they called him that after he died, right? That they had the nerve to call him that. So this word is still powerful and relevant for that reason. And often, very often, this is a conversation I end up having a lot with people at like my job or just around, because people go, oh, well, if Black people can say it, why can't we? And it's because our experience with that word is unique. It is our unique, we are the direct targets of that word in a way that no one else is.
Right.
Like,
and I think like, sorry if I can cut in there, like, because we talked about this too, like, like words, we have to like accept the fact that like words have power. And I think like when we say, oh, the N-word, it's not really a big deal for me to say it. Like, I think what we're kind of doing is we're denying the fact that like, no, words like mean things and they have power. And the reality of the N-word specifically is that it was used to have power over Black people, like systemically for centuries. And I think I've heard people kind of draw up false explanations, like, well, I grew up in the hood, or I grew up poor, or I grew up around Black people, or I'm dating Black people. I've heard all those things before. Like, I mean, what would you say? What would you say to that part?
So, it's first, it's very frustrating how much people come up with these fake arguments for that, but they don't really hold water if you test them or if you really think about them. Because when people say that, like, oh, I grew up in, like, when people say I grew up around Black people, very often what they mean is they grew up poor. They grew up in the hood. They grew up in that kind of environment is what they get connected to. And what happens there is that people are limiting the experience of Black people. And not just that, but what it takes to be Black is to be poor, struggle, and all of those negative aspects of our experience. Like when someone says, oh, I grew up around Black people, but they grew up in that sort of environment, they're making those one-to-one. And that happens to Black people, not only from others, but within our community, that if you behave a particular way, people say, oh, you're not Black. Or what you hear a lot is white people will say to Black people as a compliment, you're the whitest Black guy I know. And they're saying that to the most articulate Black guy they know, the smartest Black guy they know, and those are not compliments because it relates. It relates all of those other aspects. It says, oh, in order to be Black, you must be this. And what that is not healthy things. Well, and one thing that is very frustrating to me is when people say, oh, I've dated Black people, or I'm dating a Black person, or I'm even married to a Black person. When it comes to the N word, and I will not use it out of respect because I think there's no place in this conversation. But for a person who is married to a white person, to a Black person, you would still, under those circumstances, not be called the N-word. You would be called a N-word lover, which means that even in the circumstance that you are married in love or you have had children with a person who is an African American, you still aren't an N-word, you're N-word adjacent. And that's like the closest you can get. But even there, you're not the same. No one looks at you and calls you an N-word. They call you an N-word lover.
You know, I'm thinking of that story now, like from the time that you did the open mic. You know what I'm talking about?
Man.
Okay, so I think this might like be a good one to bring up. Can you tell it in like 3 minutes?
Yes. Okay. So I went to an open mic. I'm a comedian. We do that. Ho. And I went one particular night at this place, and there was it was at an African business that sells authentic African jewelry, artwork, and all that. And one of the people that performed was this young kid. He was a rapper, and he was Arabic. He was of Middle Eastern Arabic descent. Now he did a rap song where he said the N-word, and people were furious, and it sparked up a whole conversation, right? And now what was personally funny to me was, dude had the nerve to come into an African business in a room full of grown Black people and thought it was okay for him to say the N-word in his song.
Right. These, and there were older Black people there too. Like these are probably people who remembered lynchings.
Right. These are people who remember lynchings. This is an African business, which means those are people who have done the work to tie their Africanity to the two cultures and practices in Africa. So it's not just, these are people
I got you.
On the topic, right?
Yeah.
And he thought it was okay for him to go in there and say that word in a rap song. Now, what also was funny to me was he had two homeboys with him. One was white and one was Hispanic. He didn't even have a Black guy on his panel to defend him. But what struck me was that when people were discussing it and arguing about it, though it stayed civil, one thing that he would do is he said, I'm a person of color too. I've been oppressed too. I'm a person of color too. But what he never said, and what was that he was Black. He never said, I am Black. I am African American. He kept saying, I'm a person of color too. Which means, even at its bare minimum, even he understands that level of separation. He knows that even though he's a person of color, he knows better than to claim to be a Black person. So he knows the experience is different. What was interesting to me, to say the least, is that he didn't even make that connection, right? He didn't make the connection that, oh man, at the very least, I shouldn't say this in front of this particular crowd of people because they might feel some type of way. There's a weird level of, and there it's almost like an entitlement, especially as a rap artist, because there are a lot of rap artists that are out today that definitely should not be saying the word, right? People that either do not appear to be Black and who don't identify as Black.
Right. The bottom line being there, like they're kind of borrowing an experience that's not theirs. And the problem is it's not like a positive one. It's a really negative experience.
It's a very negative one. And
it's
like
kind of like done lightly for the sake of being cool,
That's exactly what it is. And that's because, I'll run through this quick, but that's because Black people did the work to take something negative about them and turn it into a positive thing. At least that's how the story goes. And if you get into it, there's a lot of people who believe that you really can't do that. You're not going to be able to take this thing that means something bad and make it something that means something good. You're not really.
But that's more of an in-house issue within the African American community.
Which is an in-house issue, and I would like to say this about it, because people like to say, oh, well, if Black people say it, why can't we as people outside of the community? Whether Black people say it or not is an in-house issue. That means something Black people need to sit with each other, and we need to be discussing, should we be saying that? Should we be calling ourselves that? But that in no way affects other people's use of the word, because our experience with the word is unique and different. We were the targets of that negative word. We were the targets of it. And so, and the work that was done to try and make it a positive thing was done by us. Now that it's become cool, side note, you'll find it, especially in rap music or in lots of culture, you'll find that it just so happens to be connected to all the most cannibalistic aspects of our culture. You find it connected
like, in other words, like, crime and prostitution and all those
drugs,
sorts.
prostitution, the things that destroy us, that hurt us, and that hurt our communities. That word is peppered within there, right? So even how positive of a word is it true? Is it really? But whether we say it or not, it should be a different discussion, and is a different discussion, because it is our word.
We're starting to get, sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but we're starting to get more questions, so I want to keep moving. So let me check the chat real quick.
Got it. Yeah, and while you search this chat, I just want to say it's kind of heartbreaking that a lot of times that conversation gets had with people that you realize are ultimately just going to say the word when you're not around, because now they know you care. And they know you care, but they don't. They've used the fake arguments to feel like they're a good person or like they're justified in saying it. But when you show them that doesn't make sense because of X, Y, and Z, then they're just going to say it when you're not around. I've had that happen to me in so many workplaces with people that I like, and
so and I get what you mean. You mean. Okay, so pivoting conversation. Somebody asked, like, what is kind of like your take on just, I think we were talking about this one time, and I called it like benign racism, like the kind of racism that you find in, especially like a community like the Asian American community, let's say, or for our audience, especially the Indian community. There's a kind of what I would call like a benign racism that underlies like certain things. And like, what's your impression of that? Like, what I mean is kind of like, a lot of people that I know, like, have experiences of their parents, like, not like hating Black people or something like that, but just saying like, oh, be careful, or, those kinds of like little things. And what do we make of like those kinds of forms of like, where it's not like this explicit hatred, but it's just more of like an underlying attitude that's there, towards African American community.
Those sorts of like ideas can become, and they often do become, very dangerous, because it's one thing if you're like, oh, you know what, I don't really like Black people all that much, because if that's a person's opinion, well, I mean, that's a person's opinion, and it becomes important all across the board that the more you learn, then the more you experience being around people, in this case Black people, that are familiar with the history and all that helps reshape that sort of opinion. But where that gets dangerous is in stuff like work, is in stuff like jobs. Because what you'll find is someone who doesn't like Black people that much is probably not going to be hiring Black people all that much. And it's a lot of the underlying like stereotypes and ideas we have about Black people that affect things like a black person, like a black sounding name, not getting picked out of resumes that are the exact same. And people have done studies like that all around. But that's how those little ideas and opinions, that's just one example of how they can actually directly affect people's communities when those ideas transfer over, you know?
Right. So in other words, it's kind of like, yeah, maybe in themselves, not malicious, but like it's building a worldview, building a pattern of thinking, which
Right.
People might not realize like has a much bigger impact on the Black community than they're experiencing themselves.
Right. And an example would be like, and people have suffered because of this in particular. Like Ahmaud Arbery, he was running in a neighborhood, right? And people got so scared because they didn't know who he was that people started following him and they ended up taking his life, which described like that is the exact same situation that happened to Trayvon Martin. The problem there is that there's this fear of Black people that when we act on fear, especially something misplaced like that, we end up calling the police. The police come and their fear is at a heightened level because it's a Black person. Whereas like if someone sees some white guy just run around their neighborhood, they don't feel that. And why? And that's a deep question people have to ask themselves. But it's like, why is it that seeing a Black person running around my neighborhood makes me think something must be up, right? And that I have to do something about that. You know, those things become dangerous when we are acting out of fear and ignorance. People get hurt. And that's why it's really important to learn so that you build on.
Right. You can address it. Right.
Right. You build on that ignorance, which will then shape the reality. And so you would ideally have less fear.
So we got a few more questions that I at least want to hit, and then we're going to open it up to a general discussion for everybody on the call. So let me just pick out two here that I think are especially important. For one, does the Black community see people who have migrated here more recently, like the person who's asking, saying like, especially for us, where like we come from South Asian, Indian community, does the African American community see like recent immigrants to America as privileged? And based on that, like what can migrant communities, like more recent migrant communities, do to address that? And then another thing, I'll just throw it out there so that we can hit both. What do we make of the whole fact that people are rioting? Like, what do we make of that response? Is that the response we should be making? Is it right? Is it wrong? So which one you want to tackle first?
Okay. We'll tackle the migrant issue first of all. I do think that we do perceive a level of privilege. And a lot of that has to do with perception. People perceive people from other cultures a particular way. And that can be to their betterment or their detriment, right? Mm-hmm. So, but
right,
also,
it's kind of like, I'm thinking of this image of like, you know, like let's just pick on the like Asian stereotypes here. And I'm not like endorsing these stereotypes, but let's just say like the kind of the stereotype of the hardworking, very intelligent, highly educated Asian immigrant coming to America, you know, like submits job resume, gets job, like end of story, right? But right. Whereas like, oh, well, these African Americans, right? You know, like there's kind of there's that clash there. So I guess there is like a kind of privilege, like in that way too.
Yeah. Like what we like. I'm not too educated on this in particular, but like things I've heard from people of diverse groups is that sometimes particular families or cultural groups that migrate here, they migrate here with a plan. So people come here, they start a business, and when other people migrate from the same country, they're like, oh, hey, what's up, homeboy? Yeah.
Right. That. Like, hey, oh, hey, I got a cousin in Philly. I got a cousin in Houston, you know, like
right.
that kind of thing.
And there's this web of community connection. So people, like, they're holding hands and they're building together when they get here, which isn't something, when that's nothing bad, like, at all. That's how the game works. You know, we work together, we build together, right? And that's how we strive. What you find is that there's lots of African American people and African American cultures and stuff. No, we're very divided out here, but we're able to peep that. Like, oh, I'm sorry, we peep that as like it's kind of like a street term, means that we see that. For anyone who's not familiar with it, like, yeah, man, I peep that. Like, so,
Thank you for educating.
right? Yeah, take that, use it at school. Like, but like that's something that people see and that we try to develop within our own communities, but because of different circumstances, without getting too into it, it's difficult for us to make a lot of those connections, you know, where you can go anywhere and be supported. And I'm positive that's not a foolproof plan, but like that's one of the ways that, like, migrant cultures, as far as I know, and I'd love to learn more about it, but the migrant cultures come here and do well. One of my coworkers, who's also who's an Indian dude, super intelligent, very educated, he had asked me a question, and he was like, why is it that a lot of the immigrant cultures come to America and they get right past Black people? They come here, like, from different places. They come here from countries that are much worse off than America is. Because let's be real, America, especially as a Black person, is not the #1 nation in the world. But it is definitely, there's so much more opportunity here than there can be in some other places. So why is it that people from other places come here and speed past us? And that, like, to me, it's an interesting thesis question to come from, because there are answers for that. Tulsa, Oklahoma, the legacies of that, because Tulsa, Oklahoma is not the only race riot that was just a massacre on Black people. That's a very interesting thing to get into and just to learn about. But there's a reason why. And as you start to learn more about that, it makes our experience make a lot more sense. That I think there is a particular level of privilege that at least we perceive that.
Right. So I'm gonna shift to the other question just to keep us rolling here.
Yes. The rioting.
Yeah, the rioting, looting question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, to get into that one, oftentimes I've heard it said a whole bunch on Facebook, a whole bunch in person, and all over. People say that it's wrong that man got killed, but rioting and looting isn't the answer. And what we should be doing is taking that and flipping it around.
Yeah.
Like, it's so important to think about that as people should not be rioting and looting, but a man lost his life, and a man did not just lose his life. A man was killed by the people that are sworn to protect him, that are sworn to protect us, and the authority that keeps us safe. They mishandled their job and they took his life. Now, I do not agree, and I don't condone people looting, because that doesn't do anything. Like, you're hurting people, you're hurting businesses, you're hurting people all over when you do that, and you're not making the change. The rioting is wrong. And there's a place for that energy, that pimped up frustration, that anger that explodes and leads to people wanting to break things. There is a place for that energy. It's difficult to find because it takes a level of focus that's hard to find when you've been left unheard time after time after time. People end up holding hands and kumbaya, but no change gets made. And so after Trayvon, you have Ahmaud Arbery. After Ahmaud Arbery, you have George Floyd. You have Breonna Taylor. Like, these are different situations where people in places of authority have consistently done their jobs wrong, either not have been held accountable, and most of those, I said, they're still pending, right? And it's like, it's hard to find.
So it's like there's people who have all this, like, kind of pent up rage over the injustice that's happened. So it's not like, I think like, you know, what I'm kind of getting from you, and I agree with what you're saying. It's like, yeah, the rioting and looting is wrong, but we need to look at like what made people decide to do that.
Yes, yes. And very often people end up looking at that issue and they cherry pick the part they want to be frustrated by. Oh, I'm frustrated by the fact, or like it angers me the people are rioting and the people are looting, but somehow managing to skip over what led people to do that. You know, and to me that's just, it's not fair to cherry pick and be like, oh, I'm mad about the rioting and the looting, but have nothing to say about police misconduct or the unlawful loss of life, which is what that is, an unlawful loss of life that took place, and the lack of movement to protect that, right? To protect the value of a person's life. So it's like, and then that's why it's like, I understand we shouldn't condone rioting, we shouldn't condone looting, but it's really important that we don't let that disguise us or distract us from the real conversation. And we should be able to fully be against rioting and looting and fully be for stopping and changing police brutality, like stopping that and changing and increasing police accountability. Those two conversations shouldn't drown each other out. And a lot of people, I think, rioting and looting as an excuse to not have the protest conversation. Because they want
to and I think we're kind of like turning it into like a kind of a binary issue, you know, where it's either like, well, either you support all this or you support none of it, you know? And, you know, as reality often is, it's a lot more complex than that. Someone else brought up something in the chat, and I only want to touch on this real lightly just because I don't want to derail, but but you know, right, just don't, but just you know, what happens when like we try and bring up these kinds of conversations and it turns to like discussions about political parties and like certain political figures. Again, I think like we have to learn how to have these conversations in a way that stays relevant to what's the real like heart of the matter. You know, and like for me, like my conviction is just like, look, Black Lives Matter. It's in the name, lives. Like this is a life issue. This is a pro-life issue. So like, you know, for us as Catholics, the church is not behind, like the church is not a political party where like we have our pundits and we have our particular stances, but you know, like the church stands for core values of our faith and seeks to bring those values into the world. And for us as Catholics, like one of the most indispensable values in the social justice, social issues, social ethics, whatever, is human life. So anytime it's an issue of human life, the church has to speak up. So like whether it's the unborn, whether it's the poor, whether it's the uneducated, people on death row, like whatever the case is, like it's still a life issue. Like we can't just throw away a human life. Like, and I think that, you know, and I want to respect the fact that like as a consequence of riots, like people have lost lives. That's wrong too, right? But we have to again look at like the first, the kind of the ground zero event for those riots was the loss of a life. So we have to find a place to address all those things and do it in a way where we're not getting so like kind of like, I don't know, I guess like trigger happy, I guess is like the best way I could say it. Like we don't want to get trigger happy over these kinds of things where like, you know, if I say, like if I bring up this particular issue of just Black Lives Matter and then somebody says, oh, well, you know, do you vote for this, this, and that? And like, okay, well, that's a separate conversation. Your vote is according to your own conscience. Like more fundamental than that, look, somebody died, you know, somebody died, and we have to find a way to treat that, like, and have a conversation around that. And you know, we can do, and I really believe that we can do that with a level head if like our starting point is one of charity, and one of genuine like desire to know the heart of the person who is suffering. We got a lot of questions, and but I do want to open the floor now, and I'm going to kind of be like the moderator at this point. So
Got it.
what I'll do is, for people on the call on Zoom, you can raise your hand. So if you want to speak, or if you want to like ask a question, just raise your hand. Like, in the participants window, like I don't remember exactly where you can do it, but
There's a button for that?
am I thinking of WebEx? I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'm thinking of WebEx, aren't I?
Oh, nope, you can do it. You just got to click
Okay.
on you. Yeah, if you click on participants and then click on your name, you can. I didn't know you could do that. That's so cool.
Dope. So, so yeah, if you want to talk, just raise your hand, and then I'm going to be the moderator. So please don't unmute yourself. Let me unmute you, because I wanted, we got like 30 people on this call at least right now. I want to make sure that everyone has the chance to speak and we're not talking over each other. So if you want to talk, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll open the floor.
Awesome. Also, real quick, very unimportant. I know the thing I mentioned earlier. Well, okay. When I go out to poetry spots, one thing that we do is like if somebody says something that we really feel, one thing we'll do is like you snap. If it's like that was cool, you don't want to clap and interrupt it. I don't know if people want to take that and do that. That's something I like, and I do it in just regular conversation now too. Like someone says something that just hits you, you're like, dude, yes. That's something that even if you're
snapping all around here.
Yeah. Even if you're muted, it's just something you can do if you feel it. I feel it. I don't know. I wanted to share that with you, so you can take peep and you can take snapping with you. So
I don't see anyone raising their hand yet. So
my feelings are hurt. All right. Well.
Let me see. I'm just checking chat here. Nope, still nothing. Someone saying, I don't know how to raise my hand. Okay, Kawada, you can talk. Just unmute yourself.
Hello, I just want to thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Man, this is so cool.
People are snapping for you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand on this. I'm technologically
Well.
Anyway, this is just like a simple question. So I've like heard in different circles and different conversations, this is a very simple question. Just even like using the word African American versus Black, I've always wanted to know what is the appropriate term.
Well, first of all, thank you for your question. I'm actually very glad that you asked, because that's something I've gotten into just a little bit, so I can't give a total in-depth answer. But there are people that are scholars within Black history and within Black culture who believe we should not be calling ourselves Black, because Black, it just has its roots in devaluing a person to be a thing. I think that and so we should be calling ourselves out of those two. I think the preferred would be African American, but even that can be kind of touchy, because some of us don't want to stamp American on us along with our experience of what America has consistently and continues to be for us. And
there's kind of a debate.
There is a debate, and that's
okay.
one that's also, I think that one too is kind of like one we're dealing with as an in-house issue. So I think really what it is, it's all about respecting whoever you're speaking to. If they prefer to be called Black, call them Black. If they prefer to be called African American, then just out of respect for whoever you talk to. That might be like a weird thing to ask first time, but especially for someone.
If it comes up, kind of thing, right?
The only reason why I asked this is because I've heard discussions like viewing from the outside of African Americans or Black people coming together and discussing this. And basically what they say, they prefer Black and not African American because their idea is there are African people that may have been born in the United States and they are technically American. So for me, I was born and raised in Houston, so I would be Asian American.
Right.
So we would be talking like that. So that was the reason why I brought that up. And I thought it was a valid question. I just wanted to hear from you. So
yeah, it really is a valid question. And it is a very interesting one, to say the least. I also think people really like Black, and we tend to go with Black because it's great for branding, for lack of a better term. Black Lives Matters. I mean, like and Black is beautiful is a phrase very important to us, and especially through our revolution, and within this nation, and gaining our power and our self-respect. But Black might not be the best thing for us to be calling ourselves. So I think the best thing to do would be like, just at least in practice, is just respect it. It's just like asking a person, hey, what do you prefer to be referred as? Because what that also does, as far as not just going with Black, it pushes, and this is more the in-house thing, but what it would do is for us is push us to learn more about where specifically we're from, right? Because I have a lot of friends from other places who are like, oh, my family is Italian from Sicily, but as an African American and like a whole bunch of people in my generation were slaves, I'm not entirely sure how to access that myself. So I have to go do my own personal homework. So I think that's just a conversation to have with someone if it comes up.
All right. Any other hand raises? Thanks for answering, Hannibal. And I'm not trying to cut anyone off here. I'm just making sure that we keep our conversation chugging along.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry if my answers are running long. I'm having such a good time right now.
This is okay. Like, guys, I've known Hannibal for many, many years, and he has the gift of gab. So, all right, Blasina.
Hi.
Yeah, okay.
Hello. It's really nice to meet you. My name is Lucina. But I had a really quick question. So I support the riots that's happening right now because that's in history. That's how we've been like going forward, right? With Tiananmen Square and Arab Spring and Hong Kong. But the way that I'm supporting this, because I can't go outside right now because of COVID and stuff, is through social media. And
Right.
so I try to have good civil conversations with people. And one person brought up Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King Jr. MLK, like, he advocated for nonviolent, like, protests and passive resistance for civil rights, but Malcolm X did not. And so when I was talking and I was arguing for Black Lives Matter and for riots, they were saying, oh, MLK, he's rolling in his grave right now. What do you say about what they were talking about? But what for MLK and also for Malcolm X, what were they trying to do, and what were they trying to advocate for?
First of all, thank you for having the confidence to have those conversations on social media. That is incredibly difficult and very draining. And it means a lot to a lot of people when, I don't know if you're African American, I should actually specify, but for people to have that conversation that aren't us, in the case that you're not African American, and if you are, either way, it takes so much to answer those questions. So first of all, with Malcolm X, to put it simply, he did not want or endorse like a race war. That's not what it was about. What he pushed for was for Black people's own self-respect and to respect ourselves enough to get our own wealth. The phrase "by any means necessary" doesn't just mean with violence and beating people up. It means what it says, by any means necessary. That means controlling your economics, controlling your education, controlling how you view yourself and your self-image, right? And that's honestly the most like dangerous thing he could have wanted, you know, because if Black people truly did take that by the horns and start to respect ourselves in that way, I personally think that would actually be way more violent than you would think. It would be way more violent than people going around and all this stuff. And also, lots of gun laws and gun reform came up when African Americans, as part of the Black Panthers and stuff like that, when they started wanting to have guns to show off and be able to defend themselves, that's when gun control really starts to take off. So even like that particular issue, you find it's got a little supremacy sprinkled in there, and that's something interesting to get into. As far as Martin Luther King wanted the same thing. He wanted us to love ourselves and for everyone to love each other, right? Also, after he died, there was a bunch of riots after he was killed. And after there were the riots after Martin Luther King was killed is when we got like the Civil Rights Act and really had moves made. So even in that example to a person, it's like Martin Luther King spent years fighting for this stuff. After he died, there was riots. Then people were, okay, we better, you know. So it's, to a particular degree, I think it's disrespectful for someone to say Martin Luther King will be rolling in his grave. How dare you behave in such a way? Because they probably didn't do their homework enough. Also, Martin Luther King had armed African American people that went with him to places to protect him. And there's a difference between wanting violence and defending yourself. And that's a conversation lots of people understand, but when it comes to race issues, we try to act like we don't. Like,
if I can jump in on that, Hannibal.
Yes.
It kind of reminds me in some ways of the conversations we have like within the church about like murder versus self-defense. And what I'm kind of getting from your answer too is how like we kind of sometimes we paint like as third parties, we kind of paint Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as like a binary kind of thing, where like MLK was peace and love and Malcolm X was not, you know. But I think like from what you're saying, like it's real clear that like the situation is a lot more complex than that. You know, there's a lot more fine details here. And I've had to learn over time too. You know, I don't agree 100% with Malcolm X, but like I also have a lot of respect for the fact that like he advocated for basically for the African American community to defend themselves and to have the power to defend themselves. So I think that like that's kind of like the message that he was like, that was like the core of his message. That's my understanding as like someone who's a third party, you know?
Right.
Go ahead.
And well, I'll let you keep going, but it's very important to when you start to understand just how radical the idea is of Black people to respect themselves, it reshapes understanding like Black people wanting to defend themselves, right? So if you're part of the group that has their foot on Black people's neck, you probably don't really want them to be armed and know how to use them. So of course, right, when Malcolm X comes up and he's talking about arm yourselves, there's a level of
he's coming from a place where like you're already in self-defense mode.
Right, which he was right. But then also it becomes in like coming from the opposite side that wants to demonize him. Man wasn't perfect, but if you're trying to destroy his message, you would make it about, ooh, look what they're doing wanting to gather these guns. Just like with the example we said with rioting and looting, where people can miss the real message because they get focused on this part. It's the same thing there. People get afraid, and especially they did back then, people got afraid of Malcolm X saying we should be willing to fight to protect ourselves. But they don't look at why would these American citizens even need to be gathering guns to defend themselves from the police? What's going on there? You know?
Right. So as always, there's deeper issues at work here, you know?
I thank you both so far for those questions. I love this.
I see Angel's hand up. So Angel, you go ahead. Thanks for the question, by the way, Blessina. That was a good one.
A very good one. Get it? Yes.
All right, Angel, go ahead. For Angel's iPhone, smiley face.
My name is Angel. My question is kind of just regarding, kind of based off of Lucina's, about usually when I'm having a conversation with someone about this topic, and usually someone in the brown community, the South Asian community, they always bring up this debate. They're like, I don't feel like it's my place to say anything. This is, I often get this is a black and white issue. So what place does my voice have? And then there's another kind of part of the argument. They're like, we should make way for their voices. We should be listening to them. And I never really know how to answer this.
Mm-hmm.
So just what you have on that matter.
Well, first of all, thank you for your question. It's actually, so it becomes, allies are very important, because Black people doing these things on their own has often made it easy for people to just box us up and throw the whole concept away. What I'm seeing in the protest right now, for example, I'm seeing a lot more diversity that I've ever seen in any of these Black Lives Matter protests and people moving for change. So representing that you support people is very important, and that this isn't a Black people issue, right? This is a everyone issue, because it's not okay for anyone to be getting mistreated by the police. So it becomes important for your voice to be present. As far as making way for the voices of African Americans, I think that is important, because there's this idea of, within the Black and white, communities and discussions and disparities, an idea of a white savior, a white person who's like, look at me, I'm saving the Black people, ha ha, dab. And you don't want to be that person. So it becomes very important to allow to be there and stand with Black people, but not be attempting to take the spotlight, because it isn't about, it isn't about, it isn't about you, or the proverbial you, the you being us or we. It's about the movement and what's going on. That can be an interesting conversation to have, but I think the important thing to do is to, in those situations, allow Black people to speak, and referring to Black people, on those topics. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. And if not,
yes,
just
thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was a good question. I'm really appreciating this conversation too, guys and girls. All right, is anybody else up to speak or to ask questions? I'm just checking on chat here. Bennett, go for it. And then Roshan, you can go next. After Bennett.
Yeah. What's up? First off, yeah, this has been pretty great. It's been awesome to hear from both of you guys. Yeah, I think one thing that I just been noticing in terms of this conversation, mostly through social media and through etc., is majority, I think, agrees that racism exists in America and it sucks. We need to do everything we can to fight against it. But the tension I'm seeing is recognizing it as systemic or not systemic, institutional or not institutional. So I'm just interested to hear what are your thoughts in regards to that, and even just a little, even something I've noticed is even the data from the research that's been done. A lot of people are saying we don't know what to do with the data itself. So I don't know. I'm just where do we? For me, it's just okay, where can I go to get more informed? What are some resources, etc., or even just this whole tension between it being a systemic thing at this point, or not systemic thing anymore, or even just yeah.
So as far as resources, I can think of only a few particular authors and stuff like that. And I mean, maybe at some point reach out. I don't know. I mean, maybe at some point reach out to me, because that's something I need to do more homework on. But I also don't want to sit here and like promote any particular people or stuff like that. But so there are two different types of racism, at least. Like, first of all, the idea of like people wanting to debate if it's systemic. First of all, it is, but that's a hard conversation to have, I think, because it forces us to question the world we live in, and that can be hard. And I know that especially in conversations about privilege, people's feelings really get hurt. And a lot of people, like, they get mad if you bring up white privilege. They're like, oh man, I grew up poor, I don't have white privilege. But white privilege doesn't even really just work like that. So racism is systemic, and some people may think that it might have been in the past, but it isn't today. I would counter that with a concept, or no, I would connect the two, the past with today, with an idea called redlining. Redlining was something where these real estate companies, I think the government did this, they would section off different areas and as places that were good for business and bad for business, right? As just a simple concept. They would separate places into, these places are good for business, these places are bad for business. And what you would find is a lot of the places that were labeled bad for business were Black and brown communities. So now what you have is businesses, banks, lenders aren't lending the same to those areas, right? They're not lending the same to those communities. So those communities start to, in time, fall apart. Also, you find too, there was like communities of Black people who did have the money that would like go, oh, oops, they would peace out. They'd try to go to the other communities where things were good for business, which would end up being mostly white areas. And then the people in those areas would leave. And so then, so the systemic, so let me come back, keep it simple. Redlining is an example of systemic racism in the past, but those lending practices, those precedents, and those standards last and relate to today. So that's where you get a lot of your ghettos from. So even if someone would say that, oh, racism isn't systemic today, first of all, yes, it is. Second of all, in some aspects, it doesn't even need to be. The standards are set. We were able to keep that. We were able to keep the system so unequal for so long that now we can kick it in autopilot, and it's just gonna run itself this way, right? So there are two different types of racism. You've got people that have their personal racism, and like that's bad. That's very dangerous. It's all bad and dangerous. But then your systemic racism is way more high functioning. It's the difference between someone going, "You can't shop here, boy," or while following you around the store, and people not hiring you, or people not giving particular people in communities loans at the same rates, or stuff like that. Those are systemic things because they last longer. And I think you'll find a lot systemic racism, are bigger systems, but they also have a lot of money involved. And there's a lot of wealth to be made on keeping those systems. Whereas the other form of racism is much more in your face. They're both dangerous for two different reasons.
Yeah, it's kind of like something you said at one point about, like, I don't remember exactly how you put it, but there's kind of like a status quo that's been set. And because we're on the good side of the status quo, we think, well, this is fine. How could something be wrong? But like, we don't know the experience of being on the bad side of the status quo. And I think that's kind of what systemic racism is, like, as a concept, is seeking to address. It's like the status quo is not good for everybody. And it just reminds me of something, like I had a teacher when I took social ethics who said, poverty and injustice exists in the first world like it does in the second and third world. The difference in the first world is that we're much better at hiding it. And we have to learn, like, as people who live in the first world, like, America being one of the wealthiest places in the world, like, just the fact that we live in America, first of all, we're already really well off, but we're not all well off here, or like, we're well off comparatively, but that doesn't mean that things are perfect, And again, it's not about trying to make it into this binary issue of like things are right or things are not right. It's being able to say like, call out the injustice when we see it and feeling free to do so. And so that like we can actually like work on that, like work for that genuine change. Anyway.
Do you feel like I answered your question? Just for the record.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I especially appreciated how you made the connect. Like redlining I knew about, but the way you're able to like.
Ooh, this guy, you're good.
Yeah. Also, I've been loving your voices. Yo, you're killing it with the voices.
Thank you, my man. I do birthdays. Anyway, thank you so much for that question, and props to knowing about redlining because your boy did not for a long time. And really like a couple years ago, someone had said it to me, and then I looked it up, and it's one of those things that makes you go, oh, that makes this make more sense, you know? Props to that.
Thanks for the question. All right, Roshan, you've been patient. Go for it.
Oh, sorry. I think I'm holding my laptop inverted. Hey, thanks Hannibal for sharing. It was really informative. I learned a lot of new stuff. Yeah, my question is, what do you think, according to you, what is the most important step to be taken to stop systemic racism? Like, I know there have been many steps, but what according to you is like the most important, like first step towards, you know, positive?
Most important step.
Yeah, the most important steps. Well, first of all, I think the key thing too is that one of the keys to fixing a lot of these issues is thinking about the problems in different three-dimensional ways. So that's actually a really good question because I think the number one best step is 3 steps all at one exact same time. And that's incredibly hard to do because we only got 2 feet just in that analogy. But I think education is definitely one, and not just education of where systemic racism comes from, blah, 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 because it's systemic racism is almost like Bigfoot, except it's real. A lot of people don't think it is. And when a lot of people don't think that it's real, they move in that way. So there's lots of people that go, oh my goodness, here they go again, talking about racism. You know, so it becomes important to be educated on it and understand it. But then also, I think one of the, because systemic racism is big, I think you have to take it out in parts. I'd say local, like, first of all, community building, developing a diverse way of seeing the issues. Like Chris said, sometimes it's difficult for us to realize that it's not good for everyone because it's good for us. Like things are going pretty smooth for us. So it becomes important for us to diversify our ability to see the issue. You know what? Actually, I would say this. One of the best ways to beat systemic racism would be for the Black communities to become strong enough and self-sufficient enough that we can provide for ourselves. It doesn't mean we have to all go onto an island all the way out somewhere and like separate ourselves, but it comes from that strength. Like imagine if the communities that an officer hurt somebody in, he's getting his money from the African community, the African American community. Now you're not able to get away with it the same because there's more wealth behind it, there's more education behind it, and we all know. So I think one thing is going to be education for everybody, and education and growth within Black communities is going to make a huge impact on it.
And I think we have a particular role in that, being people who are outside of the Black community, but that doesn't mean that we have to be separate from the Black community. Like there are ways that we can get involved and share and grow, you know, mutually. So, you know, even for us who are outside, and I'm gonna keep it moving along just because. But thank you for the question, Roshan.
Yes, thank you for the question.
Okay, Justin, you've got your hand up, so you're up next.
Okay, Chris, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Hannibal and Chris, for having a very important conversation that has been so hard to have this conversation to begin with. I have attempted to understand different aspects of the issue that's going on, but there are not many people in my life that are willing to accept that I may say something wrong in having a discussion like this, having a difficult discussion like this. So it's very few people that I could converse with to better understand the situation. So having a conversation like this really helps me. Secondly, because of that lack of people that you can talk to, I typically turn to scholarly works or documentaries I can find. And I recently was watching the documentary 13th and the show When They See Us, which is based on actual events, and really opened my eyes to a lot of what the movement that is happening in the country these days, and better understand why this conversation is happening in light of the recent events. More importantly, it helps me to see the issue through others' eyes, and also more importantly through Jesus' eyes.
Yes.
So my request is twofold. Can you, maybe not now, but maybe in the next week or so, put together a bibliography of some works or some documentaries or articles that we could use to better understand the situation in a deeper way? And secondly, Hannibal, how are you and your family coping with the difficult situation during this heightened state of situation here?
Hang on. Before you answer that, Hannibal, take your notes, because I know your mind. You're going to forget you have to do this.
Yeah. Will they
I'll send you a note.
So as
guys,
far as...
Sorry, can I tell a story?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So, guys, Hannibal is the slowest eater I've ever met in my whole life. And
what did that do?
And there have been times where he gets so involved in what we're talking about, he pours his whole head and heart into whatever we're talking about. I've literally seen him put food in the microwave for a minute, and then he just completely forgets it's there. Hour and a half later, it's time to go, and he goes, "Oh, I didn't eat my food," and then we have to wait another hour and a half for him to actually eat his food. So I've just learned. I've just learned with Hannibal, just got to tell him no, you need to do this now. And his girlfriend tells him too. She's like, "No, Hannibal, you need to do this." She's like,
"Wow,
no, you need to do this now."
Oh man, okay.
Sorry, how is your family doing?
Wow. Well, my family's doing well, but I feel like I'm attacked. Honestly, I feel a little attacked. My family is doing well. We are all, we're pretty much all in positions that are deemed essential. My father is a flight attendant. My mom is a supervisor for an airline. My brother works at a Target, and I am an American hero on the front lines of this war against a man-slaying virus. I am a cashier at a grocery store. So I am, but as far as the virus is concerned, we're doing okay. Trying to stay out of harm's way. As far as the circumstances with issues right now, they're very stressful. It's really stressful, and part of that is because a lot of Black people, we've seen this happen before, and we've seen it end in a way where nothing really changes. I personally have a lot more faith now than I have before, because one, there's so much more diversity out for the protests than there has been in the past. Two, that means there's a lot more people coming to experience this fight for justice firsthand with their feet on the ground. And I think there's a lot of people that are going, "Oh my goodness, bro, this is for real," And then thirdly, I'm hearing a lot of the conversations go, "Okay, so what are we doing?" And normally that conversation kind of gets had in the underground communities. A lot of the super intellectual, elders and scholars around separately, but I'm hearing it talked about on like CNN. People are saying, what can we do to make an actual change put into writing? So I have a lot more faith. Of course, I ain't got, of course, I'm still a little worried that things might not actually change, but I see a bigger potential for things to change in the future. So although things are stressful, my family's doing okay, but I know personally, I've got a lot of hope that things can actually change in the future. As far as that list of movies and stuff to watch, bonus points for seeing 13. 13 is expertly done, and it really gets into the prison industrial complex for people who don't know. It also does a pretty good job of connecting, kind of like we did, but more in depth because they have a budget, connecting slavery to prisons. So it gets rid of that like gray area we don't really know too much about. It does a good job of filling that in. I am going to reach out to the people that I know, and I'm going to try my best to get that list together. A list of movies to watch, stories to listen to, and stuff like that. I even like know an author who's got like books that are like that, like, timelines of here was slavery ending. Here's this, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's today. And so I'm going to see if I can find, and I'm going to try and put together that list of movies and documentaries. I think, and I did know that you did mention that sometimes it's hard to have conversations with people because it's hard to have conversations. People can kind of get, for lack of better words, people kind of get their feelings hurt. And I think one thing that becomes important for people that really want to have the conversations like this is, as you talk to people about this, always remember that these are personal problems to us. Like myself and a lot of other Black men I know have I've personally had to deal with the fact that Ahmaud Arbery died doing something that I do, going for a jog through a neighborhood that I don't look like I belong in. So it's always like, come from that place of, how do you feel about this? And although I want to talk about facts and statistics, always have that the necessary emotional empathy in place with the discussion. That way it doesn't go in a way that people's feelings start to get hurt,
Thanks for saying that, especially Hannibal, because I think that's really like a key point. And I know that like even like us doing this discussion / webinar, like there was a little, no one had any pushback, but people were kind of like, why, and I mean, and that's an honest question. I think that like what we're talking about like kind of shows like this is the why. Like there are people in our societies who have a different experience, and it's an experience that's tinged with a lot of suffering, even if it's not in their own life. It's in the lives of their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. And so like we need to make an honest effort to look at like, how does the system that we have in place, which is never perfect, but like, how does the system we have in place today like perpetuate that? And then getting to a more personal level, and this is kind of like where I want to make the scene change, even though I want to keep having this conversation. I also don't want people to feel like they have to leave because it's getting too late. So I want to kind of do a scene change here. It's more than just seeing how the system perpetuates the situation. It's also looking at the ways that I perpetuate the situation, like all of us, like on a personal level. So I'm glad that we were able to have some questions before about like things like the N-word and stereotypes and those sorts of things, because that kind of hits at that level. For us, like as people of faith, like as a movement, in Jesus Youth, like where we really believe that like Jesus can be a part of every part of our lives here, including this. I think too often we kind of put ourselves in that place where like God stays in church on Sunday, and we deal with these issues separately. And I think that there's like a better solution than that. There's a way to bring all this together. So like, I mean, I want to kind of give like a small 2-minute personal testimony of how I've struggled with this. Like I was at, I just remember feeling a lot of anger over the whole situation. it just, it's tons of anger. And I didn't know what to do with that anger. And I was getting particularly upset that a lot of the conversations I was hearing, they were always kind of vague, and they were always like, oh, these things that are happening in these times are horrible. And like, we should pray for an end to violence. It's like the most whitewashed, and I use that word intentionally, whitewashed like way of talking about these things, and just like, say his name, like I wanted to hear it, like, I'm not trying to make George Floyd a saint or a martyr. I'm just saying, like, the poor man died. Like, give him the dignity of like recognizing that, and so like I didn't know what to do with that anger. And I went with, like, when I was in mass, I remember, like, especially when like we were getting to the part of mass where the priest says, like, this is my body given up for you. And the image that came to me was just like, when people died by crucifixion, they choked to death. Like they were nailed to the cross because it was like a way of them slowly choking out. Like they didn't die from loss of blood. They died from asphyxiation. So I thought, Jesus, I know you didn't say it, but I know that on the cross, like you were saying it, like, I can't breathe. And to connect that moment to Christ, and to recognize that, like, in the wounds of Christ, like, all of our suffering finds a meaning. And that was able to, like, bring that anger towards a good end, towards justice, instead of towards rage and violence. So that experience changed me and was part of what inspired me, like, going into this. And I want to take time now, if it's okay with everybody, to offer a time for prayer. I'm going to stop recording because I feel like I don't think we need our prayers to be recorded. But I'll stop recording, and I'll just kind of open floor for just people to pray. And if you feel like called to repentance, or if you feel called to intercede, whatever the case, please feel free to do so. Hannibal, go ahead.
Yes, real quick. If we are going to stop recording, should we do like the whole, hey, thanks everybody, peace out, and then stop recording for the prayer?
Okay, well, I'll say this. For the people who watch this in the future when it's recorded, assuming people watch this in the future, we'll make sure that there's links up for, resources, and we want the conversation to continue. And we're really grateful for anyone who did watch. And we want to thank Hannibal again. But we're not done. So for everyone who's still on the call, don't leave. We're going to take prayer time now, and this is important. So
lock the doors.
Right, so, no, please don't go. All right, so I'm going to stop, and then we'll just take time for prayer.